Hello everyone, my name is John McQueen, and in today's lecture I'll be going over the importance of deviance and the complicated dichotomy that is connected to this subject overall. If you don't mind holding all questions and comments till the end, I will be happy to answer them upon completion of this lecture. I hope that you learned something as well as enjoy today's lecture, and without further ado, let's just jump into it. So what is deviance? Well, looking at the standard definition, it is understood as the violation or the breaking of social norms within society. This can be as simple as not shaking someone's hand in the appropriate context, all the way to breaking laws that result in you being arrested or in trouble with the assumed or established authority. However, how do we as a society understand deviance? That makes sense. Meaning, if someone was to say to you that your actions or that you are a deviant or acting deviantly, would you see this in a positive or a negative light? In most situations, it would likely be seen as a negative label, since the norms we construct help govern society as a collective and allow people to know without having to overthink what is or isn't proper in society as a whole. So, to be seen as acting defiantly or a deviant is to defy and not follow the norms that allow society to go about its daily interactions without having to assess every interaction and social engagement to how you presented yourself. With that said, though, according to Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, from the functionalist perspectives, deviance is essential for society to function. So, what is deviance then? What is deviance if it is needed for society? And why does it have such a complicated dichotomy? Well, that leads us into the next step of our thought process from the last question, which is deviance. Is it good or is it bad? Well, when you hear someone say that an action is deviant, what is your initial thought? Do you think of someone stealing? Does it immediately go to someone breaking the law? Do you think of someone who has been violating common behaviors? Where does your brain tend to lead when you hear this terminology of deviance or someone that has been labeled as a deviant? While you're thinking about that, I'm going to show you a list of deviants. And while I'm going through these lists, I just want you to look at their names and think in your head, what do these people have in common? First on this list, we have George Washington. Followed up, in no particular order, we have Rosa Parks. Thirdly, we have Martin Luther King Jr. And last on this list, we have Aristotle. And as I mentioned before, I want you to think, what do these people have in common? What do these list of rebels, as we've been talking about what deviance is, what being a deviant is labeled as, what do these list of deviants or rebels have in common? On the first person we saw on the list was George Washington. George Washington led the colonists to defy the British rule and helped establish what is the United States of America, but to the English, his actions with the colonists were deviant and defied the rule at the time. Wars were fought, people were killed, and a time of normlessness and unknowing occurred. Second on the list we have Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks rebelled against the racist notions of the time of segregation by not giving up her seat and going to the back of the bus, as was the rule of the time. So this action was seen as deviant and ended up with arrests and social unease. She was, as seen by the Times, breaking the law and thus being seen as a deviant for her actions. Next, we have Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. led protests and marches and spoke on the wrongs of segregation and the racial divide that needed to be changed. The norms of the time saw this as deviant and even criminal. He was leading protests, even if they were peaceful, against the Jim Crow segregation laws that was within the American rule of law and helped pave the way for racial equality. But during his time, he was seen as a rebel rouser and a deviant and was arrested many times. Aristotle. Aristotle defined the common understanding of the most educated men. He called into question the reality of the times and asked people to think differently. This challenged the system that was known within of the times, and labeled him as a general understanding of the populace as a deviant, since it caused a sense of unease. And the typical types of thinkers at this time were not allowed to be like how he presented his thought process within this era, and thus his actions were not well received, and thus he was seen as a deviant. That being said, though, with this list of 4 that we've just talked about, on these examples of deviance being shown, I ask the question again to you in your mind while you're thinking, do you see a common theme of these particular examples? Which leads us into our next slide, where we're going to be talking about Robert Merton's strain theory. Particularly, he has other areas in there, but particularly we're going to be talking about the rebel category and the importance it places on social change. So, now thinking of the list and examples we just looked at and the rebels that were listed, we move to Merton's strain theory, as I mentioned, but focusing particularly, as talked about before, on the rebellion category. The rebellion category rejects both of the cultural and traditional achievement of goals and attempts to replace them with elements of society that enforce different goals and means. That's a lot of context, but what does that really mean? Well, while we are focusing on the 5th category proposed by Merton, it was also important to understand that norms help people understand the social contract of society. These norms we've established within various cultures help regulate the flow of everyday life, and conforming and following these allows people to be at ease and understand their environment. The 5th category proposed by Merton, or rebellion, helps rewrite these norms to help innovate social change to make things more equal for all, or otherwise known as rebels can be the inspiration or motivators. They help challenge the norms and help create social change and positive outcome to society. Just think back to some of the examples that I put on this list, particularly in the examples of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. With that being stated, it is important to mention that Durkheim held that deviance is necessary for a functional society, as we talked about a little bit earlier in the slides, and the actions of rebels or agents of change help make this possible so that society can make the changes that help make the world a better place overall. And it's important to also understand that where you might not always understand everyone's perspectives, it is important to listen, learn, and ask questions. The norms of the time are not always the best, but it requires, as Merton and Durkheim have talked about, rebels or people who are going to push against to make the social change possible. And this leads us into my next slide, which covers deviance, anomie, and conformity. The impacts of norms being challenged or changed can cause a sense of anomie or a sense of normlessness. So when social advocates such as these rebels enact rebellion or enact their category of challenging the norms, these actions do help make change or challenge the narrative or norms of the time, but we do fall into anomie, or as I just mentioned, a sense of normlessness. This can be uncomfortable, but it is necessary, as mentioned by Durkheim. Now, this sense of anomie is something that is definitely been felt in the past period of time. This lecture has been recorded in July of 2021. Within the years of 2021 and 2020, there has been a great sense of anomie or normlessness since the pandemic has interrupted the norms and the patterns and the challenges of the time, and challenging the times we are in, seeing in exposure to the continued racial inequalities that need to be changed and the various economic and systemic issues inside our world today. It is hard and it is challenging, and it is something that we are now experiencing to actually understand the sense of normlessness. But deviance and challenging the norms of our time, as we've been talking about, is necessary. Which does lead me into this quote on the bottom of your screen. You're seeing one society's terrorists are another society's freedom fighters. I find this personally powerful, and the context behind it is that you do not know who is always in the right, as one culture's virtues, values, and norms are not the same as your culture's virtues, values, and norms. And one of the things that I think is the most important to talk about, which is on here, we've talked about deviance, we've talked about anomie, is conformity, which is one of the categories Merton talks about. And I think one of the most powerful examples of how conformity can play into the everyday lives of us is through the Milgram experiment, which shows very, very efficiently the importance of rebels. Now, the Milgram experiment, for those of you who are not familiar, I'll give you a little brief breakdown, was an experiment done by a man named Milgram, and it asked participants to administer shocks to strangers, and had a plant or a confederate as a doctor or an authority figure, assumed authority, say that it was okay to do these shocks. These participants were shocked based on if they answered a question right or if they answered the question wrong. The shocks ranged from harmless to lethal. And overall, instead of questioning and saying no, as rebels would, participants complied to the orders rather than rebel or deviate from what they understood due to the authority figure telling them it was okay. The participant, who was also a plant, was screaming and yelling every time a shock was administered, so they were seeing negative consequences for their actions, but complying when an authority told them that this was okay. Now, this is an extreme example, but it's an example of how deviance is essential for society, since the norms can be wrong or lethal in this example, and we need people to question why they do what they are doing, so that better outcomes socially can be upheld and had, and not just comply to what the norms of these times are or what the authority figures say is correct. So you do not always know, as I said before, who is right. As one culture's values, people's virtues and norms are not all the same. So we have to ask the questions, and we have to have a sense of someone who's going to stand up for it, or we're all going to, if you stand for nothing, you fall for everything, is a famous quote. That leads me into the next slide here, which is towards the end of my presentation. I hope you learned something from this lecture, and that is deviance is not always what it appears. And I hope you've learned something, as I just mentioned, something new. Now, there are various ways to look at deviance. This lecture focuses on the lens of the functionalist perspective. It is important to note that conflict or symbolic interactionalism would have a different perspective, and that is a lecture for a whole another time. But this lecture is more focused on the functionalist perspective, such as Merton's string theory and Emil Durkheim's functionalist view that deviance is necessary for society. This slide here is some references. If you are interested in looking up, I will have these provided. You can read some more on Durkheim and the rules of social methodology, and you can also look into Merton's idea of social structure and anomie and learn some more about the stages. But I do want to take this time to say thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I will now field all questions, comments, and overall, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen and hear me, and I hope you've learned something new. Thank you very much.